Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a moment that literally shifted the trajectory of human history. We're looking at the direct aftermath of World War II. Now, most of us are pretty familiar with the military history, right? But today, we're going to focus on the legal and moral earthquake that hit right after the dust settled. The unprecedented horrors of this war forced the entire world to invent a completely new paradigm for international justice. It was this crazy, pivotal moment where the global community had to figure out, basically, how do you hold individuals accountable for crimes so vast they literally defy imagination? And that decision to actually hold a trial, that was a profound historical first. It was a real game changer that would alter global law forever. The Nuremberg trials brought an official legal end to a regime directly responsible for the Holocaust. Think about it. Before this, defeated leaders were usually just exiled or, executed in secret with zero due process. But here, the Allied powers chose the path of law. They indicted 24 major political and military leaders. They set up a stage where meticulous Nazi records were actually turned right back against their creators as hard evidence. It proved guilt beyond a shadow of a doubt. This wasn't just about punishing the bad guys. It was about laying down a massive precedent. It showed that absolutely no one, no matter how powerful they are, is above the law. And the ripples of that unprecedented decision, well, they're still being felt today. It fundamentally impacts every single one of us. Whenever we talk about global human rights, we are literally talking about the direct legacy of Nuremberg. That tribunal served as the bedrock for three monumental pillars that govern our modern world. First, you have the International Court of Justice, which handles disputes between nations today. That traces its roots straight back to this idea of international accountability. Then, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the framework defining basic freedoms for everyone on Earth, and it was drafted precisely because the world saw what happens when human rights are completely thrown out the window. And finally, the Geneva Conventions were codified to make absolutely sure the barbarity of World War II would never, ever be tolerated again. So to really understand how this unprecedented court even came to be, we've got to look back at how the shifting tide of the war created this incredibly unique legal opportunity. As the Allies started pushing back Axis forces in 1943, from the freezing snows of Stalingrad all the way to the skies over Europe, an Allied victory started looking like a real concrete possibility. But with that impending victory came a massive, looming question. What exactly are we going to do with the architects of all this destruction once they're finally defeated? The sheer mind-boggling scale of the global inferno that kicked off in 1939 meant that the old-school spoils of war approach just wasn't going to cut it anymore. We desperately needed a totally new mechanism to handle the fallout of a conflict of this magnitude. As that victory got closer, the big three, the leaders of the major Allied powers, had to actually sit down and plan out the peace. But here is a fascinating historical detail. Behind closed doors, Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill were deeply divided on what justice should look like. Winston Churchill actually favored swift, summary execution for top Nazi leaders the absolute second they were caught. Just boom, done. Surprisingly, it was the United States and the Soviet Union who pushed back and demanded a formal judicial process. They recognized that a very public, heavily documented trial was absolutely crucial. They needed to expose the full truth, lay the facts completely bare for the world to see, and maybe most importantly, prevent these deposed leaders from ever being seen as martyrs. So you see, their post-war planning wasn't just about drawing new lines on a map. It was about laying the logistical groundwork for a massive legal reckoning. It's kind of like a giant puzzle. For example, the decision to divide a defeated Germany into 4 distinct occupation zones, that wasn't just for military control. That physical division actually allowed the Allies to hunt down and capture the highest-ranking officials who were desperately trying to disappear into the rubble. It gave them the jurisdiction and, frankly, the manpower to seize millions of tons of documents. We're talking ledgers, secret orders, memos that would eventually build the prosecution's airtight case. Literally every strategic move, from launching the D-Day invasions to mapping out the United Nations, dovetailed into this unprecedented, massive effort to completely restructure the global order and enforce international law. But, as those Allied forces pushed deeper and deeper into enemy territory, the world began to uncover the true, completely unimaginable horrors that had been happening in the dark. It became horrifyingly clear that Germany hadn't just waged a standard war of conquest. They had committed atrocities on a massive, industrialized scale. We're talking about the sheer terror of the night raids, the brutal forced deportations tearing millions of people from their homes, and of course, the darkest reality of all, the mass genocide of the Holocaust. The absolute depravity of these acts just completely shattered the world's conscience. Uncovering these specific horrors is really what finalized the Allies' resolve. An industrialized scale of atrocity demanded an equally massive international legal response. Which brings us directly to this final, truly haunting question. How on earth do you punish acts that are this evil? I want to leave you with this exact dilemma, because this is exactly what faced the global community as they stood in the ashes of the war. There was zero precedent for this. There was no pre-existing court with jurisdiction over these kinds of horrific crimes against humanity. If you just execute the perpetrators in secret, well, do you become just like them? But on the flip side, if you let them go, does justice even exist at all? The answer the world ultimately chose was to drag those atrocities out into the blinding light of a courtroom. They forced the perpetrators to sit there and face the undeniable, documented evidence of their crimes. It was a profoundly brave choice that led straight to the creation of the Nuremberg trials, proving that even when staring down the ultimate evil, the rule of law can and absolutely must prevail.